Imagine a frozen mountain valley where the snow falls so thick it buries every road and silences every cry for help. On one such night, a lonely woman hears a strange sound beyond her fence and steps into a storm that will change her life forever. What she finds beside a broken truck is not just a wounded man and a dying German shepherd, but the beginning of a miracle no one could have planned. Before this winter journey of fire loss and second chances begins, tell me where you are watching from today, and leave your hometown in the comments so we can travel this story together. And if you believe stories of courage and hope still matter, please press subscribe now to support the channel and stay with us for this unforgettable rescue. Frostpine was a forgotten valley pressed deep into the ribs of the northern mountains. A town where winter did not merely arrive, but ruled, where snow stacked upon roofs like generations of unspoken prayers, and the wind sang through pine needles as if mourning something it could never quite remember. On that night, the storm arrived not as weather, but as a living tide of white, swallowing roads, fences, memories, and even sound itself. And in the lonely cabin at the edge of the frozen tree line lived Emily Carter, a woman of 32 with ash-brown hair always tied low at the nape of her neck. A slender but strong frame built from years of chopping wood and lifting feed sacks alone, pale eyes that once laughed easily, but now carried the quiet reserve of someone who had learned how fragile joy could be. Her warmth never gone, but carefully rationed like firewood in a long winter, after grief had taken the man she loved and forced her to inherit the heavy stillness of survival. Emily was known in Frostpine as polite but distant, capable but solitary, the widow who kept the old Carter farm breathing long after most believed it should have died with her parents, and that night she moved through her cabin in steady routines, stoking the wood stove, checking the shutters, whispering habitual reassurances to herself, not from fear, but from habit. When the first unnatural sound struck the fence outside, a dull metallic shudder swallowed halfway by snow and wind, followed by another softer noise that did not belong to storm or tree. She hesitated at the door, one hand tightening around her lantern, the other resting briefly against the frame, as if the house itself might steady her pulse. And when she stepped into the blizzard, the cold seized her breath like a punishment. The world beyond her porch existed only as swirling white and shadows that shifted without shape until the lantern beams struck metal, slumped crooked in the drifts. A pickup truck frozen in surrender, one tire gone, doors ice shut, and beside it, half buried at the threshold between consciousness and collapse, lay a man cradling a dog. The man was young enough to still carry strength in his bones, but worn enough to look older than 35, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by melting snow, unshaven stubble shadowing a jaw that once might have been clean cut, broad shoulders folded inward now by pain and exhaustion, and eyes, clear gray when they struggled open, that carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had once been trusted and then shattered by that trust turning against him. His name, though Emily did not yet know it, was Ryan Walker, a former K-9 detective suspended under the quiet stain of a case that refused to die. A man driven not by righteousness anymore, but by the stubborn ache of unfinished truth. In his arms lay a German shepherd, a young adult female about 3 years old by later estimate, tall and muscular beneath her matted coat, black and sable, fur stiff with blood and ice, her long muzzle dusted in frost, ribs fluttering faintly beneath torn skin, ears pinned low, not in aggression, but in the shallow defensiveness of pain. Even in collapse, her amber eyes remained alert, tracking Emily with a fierce intelligence dulled only by weakness, and something about that gaze, alert yet pleading, proud yet trembling, cut through Emily's fear like light breaking a frozen lake. The man's lips moved with effort, lungs scraping for breath, as he whispered a single word that the wind almost took from the world entirely. Please. Emily's first instinct rose from years of learned caution like a wall. This valley bred danger quietly, and storms did not discriminate between accident and ambush. But another instinct, older than fear and stronger than survival arithmetic, pressed forward behind it. She saw the blood freezing in the dog's fur, saw the way the man's fingers curled protectively around her, even as his own body failed him, saw the truth no storm could hide. Whatever had brought them here was already done, and whatever harm remained would only come if she turned away. She moved forward without another thought, her boots sinking into snow that fought every step. And when she reached the man, she felt the heat bleeding out of both him and the dog into the merciless cold. He sagged into her shoulder with a weight that spoke of how far he had already gone beyond strength. And she caught him with a steadiness born from years of bearing loneliness, like a physical thing. "I've got you," she said, not knowing yet how fiercely those words would someday be tested. With careful urgency, she dragged him toward the porch, the dog shifting weakly as if trying to rise and failing, until at last, all three crossed the threshold into light and fire. Warmth met cold in violent contrast. The man convulsed softly as heat returned too quickly to limbs that had nearly surrendered, and the shepherd whimpered once, a small sound, cracked but alive, before sinking into unconsciousness. Emily did not yet know the dog's name, only that in this moment she became both patient and purpose. Inside, the cabin filled with the sharp scent of blood and snowmelt as Emily worked with controlled speed, cutting free frozen fabric, packing wounds with trembling but certain hands, laying the dog near the stove with blankets layered thick while the man, Ryan, was eased onto the old couch beneath the narrow window. She noted absently that his coat bore the faded outline of a police insignia, torn away by time or intention, that his hands were rough with use, not leisure, and that even when unconscious, his hold on the dog had required her to gently unwind each finger, as if persuading him to release the last thing he trusted. Hours passed without measure, while the storm battered the walls like waves against a ship's hull. And in that suspended night, Emily learned the language of urgency again, spoke softly to a heart more than to ears, and waited for breath to steady where it barely wished to continue. Near dawn, when the storm's howl softened into the quieter menace of lingering cold, the man woke. His eyes focused slowly, confusion giving way to instinctive alertness, and he tried to rise before pain folded him back against the cushions. "The dog!" he rasped, voice stripped raw by frost and fear. Emily touched his shoulder, firm but gentle, and pointed to the hearth where the shepherd lay, breathing now in deeper, steadier pulls of air. Relief broke across his face with such naked intensity that it startled her. A man already prepared to lose everything again, who discovered he had not yet lost, the one thing he could not live without. "My name is Ryan," he said after a moment, pushing through the ache as if pain were an old companion, too familiar to demand attention. "And that's the only proof I have left." His gaze never left the dog. Emily studied him in the quiet daylight, filtering weakly through frost-webbed glass, and saw what the night had hidden. Not a vagabond or drifter, but a man carved hollow by responsibility and haunted by something unsaid. She introduced herself then in the same calm way she introduced everything she carried. Emily Carter, caretaker of what remained, and offered him water, warmth, and the conditional safety of a stranger's roof. Only later, in fragments between sleep and snowbound hours, would she learn how Ryan had followed a thin thread of evidence tied to a cross-state trafficking ring that stole, trained, sold, and sometimes destroyed working dogs like commodities. How his unit had been ambushed, his partner killed, his career shattered beneath accusations that never quite fit and yet refused to release him. How Ash, yes, she now had a name whispered like prayer, had been the sole survivor pulled from burning wreckage only to disappear into shadow again until this flight through the storm. But in that first fragile morning, none of that yet belonged to words. There was only heat reclaiming bodies, breath returning to lungs, a woman relearning what it meant to choose risk in the face of fear, a man rediscovering that refuge had not entirely vanished from the world, and a wounded dog whose heartbeat stubbornly refused to go silent. Outside, Frostpine lay erased beneath a newborn continent of snow, roads sealed by drifts that promised isolation for days, if not weeks. A town cut from the world, not only by geography, but by fate's quiet hand, and within that solitary cabin, three paths that had wandered for years through loss, disgrace, and survival crossed at last. Emily closed the door against the storm, as the wind finally loosened its grip on the night, and in that single act, unremarkable to the world beyond her ridge, three destinies slipped into alignment beneath one roof, unaware yet of fire, courtrooms, betrayal, and redemption waiting far beyond the thaw. The storm did not leave after that night. It settled in as if Frostpine itself had been pulled beneath an endless white shroud, sealing roads, valleys, and intentions beneath layers of silence that grew thicker with each passing hour. Snow swallowed the fences entirely by the second day. By the third, the world beyond the Carter cabin had narrowed into nothing but drifting light and shadow beyond frost-clogged windows. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of breath, fire, and the uncertain beating of one wounded heart that was not human. Ash lay near the hearth, wrapped in blankets that rose and fell with each shallow expansion of her chest. In clearer light, her condition revealed itself more honestly. Deep lacerations along her shoulder, and ribs where metal or fire had torn flesh, burns blistering through patches of her black and sable coat, one hind leg stiff with trauma and swelling. She was a large German shepherd for her age. Ryan estimated 3 years old, with powerful bone structure beneath the injury, the kind built for working distance and endurance. Even sedated by pain and exhaustion, her paws twitched sometimes, as if running through remembered danger. Ryan rarely left her side. He moved stiffly, bruises blooming dark along his ribs and hip, one wrist still swollen from impact, but he ignored his own pain with the practiced indifference of someone who had learned that tending to others was easier than acknowledging himself. In clearer daylight, Emily could study him more closely. He was taller than she had first realized, well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered not from labor, but from disciplined conditioning, his posture still bearing unconscious traces of authority, even as his circumstances had stripped his title away. His gray eyes were steady, but carried a kind of permanent alertness that never fully softened, the gaze of a man who had learned too many times that danger did not announce itself. He spoke to Ash in a low, constant murmur, while Emily worked, soft encouragements, apologies whispered like confession, fragmented memories that surfaced involuntarily when exhaustion thinned his guard. She learned through those murmurs that Ash was stubborn even as a pup, that she had learned scent tracking faster than any dog he had ever trained, that she had once saved her handler in a collapse simulation by refusing to abandon what her instincts told her was still alive. He never spoke of the ambush directly, not yet, but each silence carried the shape of it. Emily, in turn, surprised herself by how naturally caregiving returned to her hands. She had once nursed her father through slow decline, then her husband through sudden illness, and though grief had taught her the cost of attaching hope to fragile bodies, it had not stolen her instinct to try. Her movements were unhurried but precise. Cleaning wounds with warmed water, infused with antiseptic herbs, she still grew behind the cabin in stubborn defiance of winter, stitching what could be safely closed, changing bandages when blood seeped through layers too quickly, feeding small amounts of broth between Ash's trembling jaws when consciousness allowed. On the 4th night, Ash convulsed with fever. Her breathing turned ragged, her body burning beneath Emily's palms, while the storm outside rattled the cabin, as if echoing the violence unfolding inside that fragile frame. Ryan held her head, pressing his forehead briefly against the crown between her ears, in a gesture more prayer than training, whispering her name over and over, as if repetition alone could anchor her to the living. Emily stayed awake through the worst of it, feeding water one drop at a time, regulating temperature with cold cloths and fresh embers, tracking each shudder as if reading an unstable language she feared might vanish mid-sentence. By morning, the fever broke, not cleanly, not decisively, but enough that both of them allowed themselves one careful breath of relief. Ash's eyes opened again, cloudy but aware, and when her gaze settled on Ryan, she attempted to lift her head despite the pain. He restrained her gently, one hand steady beneath her jaw. "You're not done yet," he told her quietly. "You don't get to quit on me now." The dog's ears twitched. It was the smallest victory imaginable. Outside, the roads were gone. Radio reports crackled faintly through snow-thickened signal, confirming what the eye already knew. Frostpine was isolated for at least 2 more weeks. No medical transport could reach the ridge. No veterinarian could traverse the mountain passes. Ash's survival would be decided entirely by what remained inside that cabin, what Emily's hands could fashion, what Ryan's vigilance could sustain, and what stubborn life refused to surrender inside the dog herself. As days accumulated into a long, continuous night of care, Emily and Ryan began to fall into shared routines without discussion. Ryan reinforced the barn roof and cleared snow from vents when Ash slept deeply enough to allow him brief absence. Emily cooked continuously, meals structured not for pleasure, but for energy and recovery. Thick soups, root vegetables thawed from cellar storage, protein rationed carefully. They traded sleep in fragments, one watching while the other collapsed into brief, uneasy rest. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, trust began to form, not in declarations, but in the quiet certainty that each would return when absence was required. It was one of those nights beside the fire when Ash slept more soundly than she had since arriving. That silence finally opened enough for truth to slip through. The wind outside had quieted into a distant hiss along the eaves. The fire cracked softly. Ryan sat against the wall with his back resting near the hearth, exhaustion folding his shoulders inward. Emily brought him tea without asking. He accepted it with a nod that carried both gratitude and something more subdued. "I was K9 for 15 years, he said finally, voice low, as if the walls themselves were listening. Tracking, narcotics, rescue, dogs were the one thing in my life that never lied to me. His fingers tightened briefly around the warm mug. Then came the case, cross-state ring, stolen working dogs, smuggling routes disguised through rescue transports. Someone inside fed locations. We walked into an ambush. My partner didn't make it out." Emily did not interrupt. She understood the rule of grief well enough to know that it needed space more than solutions. "They blame me," he continued, not angrily, but with the tired resignation of someone who had repeated the facts to himself too many times. Evidence disappeared, witnesses recanted. Ash was the only dog pulled alive from the wreck. After that, she was taken, off the books, sold, or hidden. When I found Scent again months later, it was already too late for the rest. I followed it into this storm because it was the last lead left that hadn't vanished. His gaze drifted back to where Ash lay breathing softly. "She's the last piece of the truth that didn't die." Emily felt something shift behind her ribs at that. Not pity, but recognition. She too lived guarding remnants of what once had meaning. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "what survives isn't just evidence. Sometimes it's what carries the choice forward." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if reassessing the quiet woman who had dragged him from a storm without hesitation. In that moment, he saw past the reserve and into the quiet endurance beneath it. Ash began to improve more steadily after that night. The shaking subsided, her appetite strengthened, the swelling along her flank receded enough that she could attempt to shift without whimpering. And when at last, she managed to lift herself halfway onto her forelegs. Trembling violently but upright, Ryan laughed. A sound startled out of him, as if he had forgotten he still owned it. Emily felt her throat tighten at the sound, surprised by how much of the room it seemed to fill. By the 12th day, Ash insisted on standing fully. Her injured leg barely supported her weight, and she collapsed again almost immediately. But the intent had been declared. From then on, each hour brought small rebellions against weakness, a few steps toward the fire, a slow turn of the head in response to Ryan's voice, the first faint thump of her tail when Emily approached with fresh bandages. And with each improvement in Ash, something else thawed inside the cabin as well. Ryan spoke more easily. Emily found herself answering without filtering every word through caution. They still carried their distances carefully. Two people shaped by loss rarely rush collisions, but the air between them no longer felt empty. It felt shared. On the 19th night since the storm began, Ash slept without medication for the first time. Her breathing had slowed into deep, steady rhythm. Ryan watched her from the floor, exhaustion finally conquering vigilance as he leaned his head back against the wall. Emily added another log to the fire and sat opposite him. Neither spoke. Outside, the snow continued its patient occupation of the valley. Inside, something quiet but unyielding had taken root. They did not yet name it. They only felt that in the long cold, something warm had refused to go out. When the roads to Frostpine finally loosened their grip on the valley and the first snowplow carved a narrow vein of black asphalt through the mountains, the world rushed back in with all the force that isolation had delayed. Sound returned before people did. The distant grind of engines, the echo of radios, the rumors carried faster than vehicles ever could. Frostpine remembered how to whisper again. Emily noticed the change at once. It was not in words, but in glances. Neighbors who had once greeted her with quiet warmth now measured the space between their smiles. Delivery drivers lingered a little too long by the gate. At the small general store, conversations dimmed when she stepped inside. The valley had always been close-knit, but its closeness was the kind that tightened before it embraced. Ryan observed it from a distance. With Ash still regaining strength, he limited his presence to the cabin and the surrounding slope. But his instincts never stopped scanning. He had the posture of someone perpetually listening beyond what could be heard. A habit embedded not by training alone, but by betrayal. Ash now walked slowly but steadily. Her burns had healed into raw pink scars beneath regrowing fur, and her injured leg carried a faint, permanent hitch. Yet her eyes had sharpened into their former fierce clarity, alert without rest, tracking motion and scent with renewed purpose. She was a German shepherd built for work rather than ornament, strong-chested, narrow-waisted, all muscle and intent. And even in healing, she radiated quiet authority. It was on the first full day after the pass reopened that the name Holloway returned to Emily's life. Mark Holloway arrived first. He was 45, broad in the shoulders but soft through the middle, his brown hair thinning and always slicked straight back, as if he feared the disorder of wind more than the cold. His smile had once been charming in childhood gatherings, but time had hollowed it into something transactional. He dressed too warmly for Frostpine, heavy coat, stiff with newness, boots never marked by real labor. 2 hours later, his brother Dean Holloway followed. Younger by 3 years, Dean was leaner, sharp-featured, with restless eyes that seldom rested in one place long enough to build trust. He had the tendency to tilt his head slightly forward when speaking, as if challenging disagreement before it had the chance to form. They were cousins by blood, distant in years but intimately tied through inheritance. Their father had been Emily's uncle, a man whose charm masked the same ambition both sons now wore openly. They arrived with concern first. "We heard about the storm," Mark said on the porch, voice sonorous with practiced sympathy. "About the accident. We just wanted to check on family." Emily stood framed in the doorway, her posture calm, her expression polite without invitation. "I'm fine. We're fine." Dean's eyes drifted past her, catching. Briefly on Ash lying near the hearth, and on Ryan seated at the table, something unreadable shifted behind his gaze. "You've got company." "A man who needed help," Emily answered evenly. Ryan rose, his height drawing instant recalibration in both brothers' postures. He offered no handshake, only a still, neutral presence that politely discouraged familiarity. The Holloways stayed less than 15 minutes, just long enough to see, to assess, to begin assembling something invisible. 3 days later, the letter arrived. It was official in appearance, stamped and formatted with the confidence of institutions whose authority people rarely questioned. It claimed that property taxes on the Carter land had lapsed into delinquency, that maintenance standards had fallen below code, that the farm demonstrated diminished stewardship capability under inheritance conditions established in Emily's father's will. Ryan read it twice. Emily read it once without blinking. Then she folded it slowly and placed it beside the stove. "They couldn't take what they wanted by kindness," she said quietly, "so they've chosen paperwork." The Holloways moved quickly after that. A surveyor appeared without appointment. A county clerk called requesting verification of maintenance logs. A polite but persistent officer delivered notice of preliminary review. Each action in isolation was harmless. Together, they formed a net. Ryan documented everything: photos, dates, names. In this, the old investigator returned with chilling clarity. But something else gnawed at him beneath the legal maneuvering. Something older, less visible. Ash sensed it first. It was late afternoon when she stopped short near the tree line behind the cabin. Her body stiffened, tail dropping low, ears rotating forward in sharp, simultaneous attention. The scent hit her instantly, faint to human senses, but unmistakable to hers. Old oil, old rope, and beneath it all, buried beneath years of rot and snow, the long, stale residue of fear. She growled once, deep and restrained. Ryan followed the line of her gaze and saw it half buried beneath fallen needles and drifted ice. a rusted length of chain. One end vanished into the snow. The metal was twisted where it had once been under strain, with a faint reddish-brown staining still etched into its grooves. He knelt without thinking. His chest tightened as Ash approached the chain with rigid caution, nose hovering inches from it without contact. Her breathing accelerated. Her paws trembled. She did not retreat. "This isn't from around here," Ryan said softly, though no one had argued. He recognized industrial tethering hardware when he saw it. This was not farm equipment. This was transport restraint. Emily stood behind him, arms wrapped around herself. "What does that mean?" Ryan lifted the chain slowly from the snow. Beneath it, embedded in the softened earth, were parallel drag marks, long since frozen. Not new, not recent, but not ancient either. "It means she's been here before," he replied. "Or someone who smelled like where she came from has." That night, without speaking it aloud, Ryan understood something that shifted the weight of the world inside him. The trafficking route had brushed Frostpine, maybe passed through it, maybe hidden within it, and if so, then the ambush that shattered his life had never truly ended. It had only spread into quieter forms. Rumors rose faster after that Emily had taken in a disgraced cop, that she was hiding something, that the land was unsafe, that the Carter farm was falling into neglect, that the Holloways were only trying to protect the valley from liabilities. Each whisper found a listener ready to believe it. Frostpine loved its own, but it loved order more. Emily felt the familiar ache of being watched without being known. Her neighbors were not cruel, but suspicion often wore kindness like a mask. Ryan withdrew further into analysis. He compared dates, vehicle sightings, old arrest logs, freight routes. The chain became his silent anchor to a truth that refused to be coincidence. And with every pattern that began to align, the certainty grew heavier. Someone had embedded their operations into the life of this town, and someone near Emily had noticed him noticing. The Holloways returned at sunset 2 days later. This time, without pretense of casual concern, they stood side by side at the gate, as if presenting equal authority. "You should consider selling before this becomes unpleasant," Mark said smoothly. Ryan stepped forward first. "You should consider leaving before this becomes evidence." Dean's lips tightened. "We know who you are." Ryan met his gaze without shame. "Then you know why I don't stop." The brothers left without further words. The air felt colder after they were gone. That night, Ash stood alert long after darkness settled, pacing the perimeter once despite her lingering pain. Ryan watched from the porch with his jacket pulled tight against the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine cut briefly through the quiet, then vanished. The town below slept. The storm had passed, but something far older than winter had begun to move again beneath the snow. And Ryan knew with bone-deep certainty, the case was not over. It had only been waiting. The morning of the hearing arrived wrapped in a quiet that felt ceremonial. Frostpine had learned to breathe again after weeks of white confinement, but winter remained its sovereign. Snow fell in slow, deliberate feathers from a sky the color of pale iron, softening rooftops and courthouse steps alike, as if even judgment itself were required to move gently in such a season. Emily stood at the edge of the porch before dawn, fastening the last button of her coat with careful fingers. She wore black wool, practical shoes polished by habit, not vanity, and her hair was braided low, in the same modest restraint she carried into all rooms where power gathered. Her face was composed, but Ryan could see the quiet strain behind her eyes. The same strain that had lived there since the Holloway letters arrived, now sharpened by the knowledge that a single ruling could unravel everything her parents had built, and everything she had labored alone to keep alive. Ryan waited beside the truck, his coat dark against the snow, posture rigid with the deliberate calm of a man stepping into a battlefield, not of fists, but of words. In his hand he carried a sealed evidence sleeve. Inside lay the chain Ash had uncovered, cleaned, documented, and photographed. He had made the calls the night before. Old contacts had answered, despite silence owed to time. An official request for case review had been filed before sunrise, but none of it was guaranteed. In courts, as on frozen roads, traction was never certain. Ash watched from the porch, standing now unassisted. Her gait still bore a faint hitch, but her presence radiated alert strength. Her ears tracked every sound. Though she would not enter the courthouse, Ryan knew she would be with him in the only way that mattered. Frostpine's courthouse was small, built of gray stone, weathered by decades of snowmelt and the quiet weight of disputes too ordinary for legends. Inside, wood benches creaked with age and human tension. The room filled slowly with townspeople drawn less by civic duty than by curiosity sharpened into appetite. Small towns rarely witnessed converging dramas. When they did, every eye drank deeply. Mark and Dean Holloway arrived together, immaculate in pressed coats that carried the faint scent of city cologne, unsuited to mountain air. Mark moved with confident ceremony, offering polite nods that suggested benevolence. Dean scanned the room, the way predators test fences, eyes quick, assessing. Their attorney followed with a leather portfolio and the serene detachment of a man paid to doubt. Emily felt the room shift as they entered. Voices softened, glances tightened. She took her place beside her counsel without returning a single stare. Proceedings opened with the language of statutes and intent. The Holloways' legal argument unfurled smoothly. Alleged property neglect, tax discrepancies, maintenance violations, breach of inherited stewardship clauses. Documents passed hands. Numbers were recited. The performance carried weight not because it was honest, but because it was rehearsed. Then Emily's counsel rose, and the rhythm changed. Receipts were entered into record. Years of payments, supplies purchased, inspections passed. Handwritten ledgers kept in careful order by a woman the town had long underestimated. Photographs of repaired beams, upgraded fencing, permits, logs of livestock counts. Each page placed upon the table felt like another quiet refusal to disappear. Mark shifted once. Dean's jaw clenched. When it came time for testimony, Emily stood. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke only of work, of seasons that took more than they gave, of choosing to remain when leaving would have been easier. The room listened with an attention born not of sympathy, but recognition. Frostpine understood survival in silence. Then Ryan was called. He took the stand not as a disgraced officer begging absolution, but as a technician offering fact. He identified the chain, described its construction, its use in animal transport operations, its serial grooves that matched equipment seized years earlier in a now dormant trafficking investigation. He traced the line not as accusation, but as connection. The Holloway's attorney objected. Jurisdiction, relevance, speculation. Ryan answered none of it with anger, only method. When the chain itself was placed into evidence, the room shifted in a deeper way. Objects, unlike rumors, carried gravity. This item, Ryan said evenly, was recovered less than 200 yards from Ms. Carter's property line. It is not farm equipment. It is identical to restraint hardware used by a trafficking ring, dismantled partially 6 years ago, an operation that remains under incomplete adjudication. The judge leaned forward, a clerk whispered. Then came the words that changed the center of the room. This witness has submitted a formal motion for case reopening to the State Bureau this morning. The Holloway's confidence fractured subtly. Dean's eyes darted once toward the gallery. Mark's polite composure thinned at the edges. I am not here to argue land rights, Ryan continued. I am here to state that criminal activity once believed extinguished has resurfaced within Frostpine's boundaries, and that Ms. Carter's property, he paused briefly, may hold relevance to that reemergence only because she unknowingly sheltered its witness. A murmur stirred the benches. Emily felt the weight of 100 recalibrated thoughts settle into the air. The judge called recess. Snow continued to fall beyond the tall windows, as if marking time for forces far larger than property lines. When proceedings resumed, the decision unfolded not dramatically, but cleanly, like ice cracking under precise pressure. The court found insufficient evidence to challenge Emily Carter's stewardship. The Holloway's documents were flagged for forensic audit, and the trafficking matter was formally referred for reopening pending preliminary review. The gavel fell. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then the room exhaled. Outside the courthouse, snow descended in wide, unhurried spirals. The Holloways exited first without comment, coats brushing past townsmen who no longer met their eyes with warmth. Their authority had cracked, not shattered, but wounded. Wounded things tended to flee or strike. Ryan noted the direction of their retreat without appearing to watch. Emily stood on the courthouse steps for a moment after the doors closed behind her. Her hands trembled only then, the delayed release of tension she had refused to display inside. Ryan stepped beside her. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The relief between them had weight enough on its own. "Your land is safe," he said quietly. "For now," she answered, her gaze lifted to the snow-softened rooftops of Frostpine. "Nothing is ever permanent here." He understood the truth beneath the words. Safety in mountain towns was a season, not a fixed state. A familiar figure approached through the snowfall, Chief Daniel Brooks, a man built broad with age settling into his shoulders, his eyes steady as river stone. He had known Ryan once professionally. Now he studied him without the distortions of rumor. "I reviewed your filing," Brooks said simply. "It's going through state channels now. I can't promise outcomes, but I can promise it won't vanish." "That's all I ever asked," Ryan replied. Brooks nodded once toward Emily. "Frostpine owes you an apology. It doesn't yet know how to speak, but it will, slowly." Emily offered a soft, unreadable smile. Ash greeted them at the truck with a single thump of her tail. She did not leap. She did not whine. She simply stood, alive, present, undeniable. Ryan knelt briefly and pressed his knuckles to her forehead. "We're not done yet," he murmured, "but we're not buried either." As they drove back up the mountain, snow erased their tracks almost immediately, leaving only the present moment visible. The courthouse dwindled into the distance. The town returned to quiet speculation. For the first time in years, Ryan did not feel like a man sinking beneath an avalanche of false endings. His case had a pulse again. Not justice yet, but motion. And motion, for the maid broken, was hope's first honest shape. Beside him, Emily watched the road with the steady gaze of someone who had defended her ground and kept it, not with force, but with endurance. Behind them, frost gathered on stone steps where verdicts had been spoken. Ahead, winter still ruled, but their feet were back on the earth. The fire came 3 nights after the court's ruling, sliding through the dark as quietly as vengeance always did. Winter had reclaimed its grip on Frostpine after a brief thaw, tightening the valley back into silence beneath a skin of fresh snow that gleamed like powdered glass beneath the moon. The Carter farm slept beneath that deceptive calm, barn beams creaking softly under frost, the cabin wrapped in amber light. Ash resting inside the rebuilt stall near the rear of the wooden structure, where she had insisted on sleeping since regaining strength. Emily woke to the sound of cracking wood, not the gentle settling of frozen beams, but the sharp, violent snap of something breaking all at once. A second later came the smell, smoke, thick and wrong, cutting through the clean austerity of snow. She was out of bed before fear finished forming. The door burst open beneath her hands, and heat rushed across the yard in a violent gust. The barn was already burning along its western wall, fire climbing the dried timber, as if it had been waiting weeks for this single breath of wind. Flames licked upward with hungry precision, devouring the old boards in fast, ruthless tongues of orange and blue. "Ash!" Emily shouted. Ryan was at her side an instant later, his shoes barely laced, coat half-buttoned, eyes already measuring angles and collapse lines. His voice cut through the chaos. "The rear stall, she sleeps near the foundation." Emily didn't answer. She ran. Snow hissed into steam beneath her feet as she crossed the yard. The heat was immediate, blistering even through winter air. The barn roof groaned, a slow animal sound of distress, embers already raining down, like sparks from a dying sky. Ryan lunged after her, catching her arm once before she tore free with a force he had not expected. "Emily, wait!" She was already at the doorway when he reached her again. Inside, smoke rolled thick along the ceiling, black and choking. The fire roared beyond the central beams, cutting off the front stalls entirely. Somewhere in the back, Ash barked once, sharp, frightened, unmistakable. Emily plunged into the smoke without hesitation. Ryan swore and followed. The heat inside was punishing. Wood exploded as nails burst from softened boards. Visibility collapsed to nothing but shifting red and shadow. Ash's scent guided Ryan even when his eyes failed him. Burnt fur, adrenaline, fear. He spotted her silhouette near the rear wall, pressed against fallen beams, her legs snagged beneath debris as flames ate steadily closer with each passing heartbeat. "Easy, girl," he rasped, crawling toward her through falling embers. "Easy. I'm here." Emily reached Ash first. She dropped to her knees beside the trapped dog, her coat already smoking along the edges. She grabbed the beam pinning Ash's leg and heaved with everything she had. Pain ripped through her shoulders. The beam did not budge. Ryan lunged beside her, and together they lifted again. This time the beam shifted just enough for Ash to yank her leg free with a desperate whine. But in that moment, something deeper gave way. The floor beneath them trembled. A dull cracking rolled through the barn like thunder trapped underground. "The old root tunnel," Ryan gasped, suddenly understanding. "It's beneath us." The floor collapsed. They fell through smoke and flame into darkness. The drop was short, but violent. Emily struck hard against packed earth. The breath knocked clean from her lungs. Ryan hit beside her, rolling instinctively to shield his head. Ash tumbled last, landing in a heap between them. Above, fire roared as the barn floor caved inward, sealing the upper inferno behind falling debris. They lay in pitch black for one frozen heartbeat as the world recalibrated. Then Ash moved. She stood on shaking legs, coughed violently, and lifted her head. Her eyes caught faint light at the far end of the tunnel, a thin lattice of moonlight filtering through iron grating once used for root storage decades earlier. She limped forward without hesitation. Ryan understood instantly. "She knows. Follow her." The tunnel was narrow and half-collapsed in places, choked with damp earth and splintered timber. Smoke pushed through the gaps like a living thing. Emily crawled first, Ash beside her, Ryan bringing up the rear as the heat followed them like pursuit. Ash's breathing was ragged now, her body shaking from exertion and inhalation of smoke. Still she moved, driven by instinct older than training. The exit was no more than a rusted hatch covered in snow. Emily struck it once with her palm. Nothing. Ryan braced his shoulder beneath it and drove upward with a roar torn straight from desperation. The hatch burst open in a cascade of ice and moonlight. Cold air slammed into them like salvation. They spilled out into the snow just as the barn roof collapsed in a deafening roar behind them. Flames tore upward into the night in a towering spire of light. Snow fell through fire in a storm of steaming, melting chaos. Ash collapsed immediately upon reaching open ground. Her body convulsed in harsh, empty coughs as smoke tore from her lungs in dark bursts. Ryan was beside her in seconds, clearing her airway, forcing shallow breaths until air returned in shaky pulses. Emily knelt on Ash's other side, hands trembling as she removed smoldering fabric from the dog's scorched flank. "She's breathing," Ryan said urgently, pressing his ear to Ash's chest. "Weak, but she's breathing." Sirens cut through the night moments later, slicing the chaos with sudden order. Patrol lights flared blue and red against the falling snow as engines descended on the farm from every direction. Chief Daniel Brooks arrived with the first wave, his face hardening instantly as he took in the scene. Burned structure, scorched earth, 3 figures kneeling in the snow beside a wounded dog who should not have survived. Twice. "This wasn't an accident," Brooks said grimly. Ryan looked up. Black soot streaked his face. No, it wasn't. It unfolded quickly after that. Too quickly for the Holloways or their associates to remain hidden behind legal armor. Accelerant traces confirmed arson. Tire tracks matched vehicles seen near the property on previous nights. Phone records unraveled the last threads. And the chain, already on record, was suddenly not just a remnant, but a warning sign ignored too long. The arrests came before morning. The entire remaining network collapsed in a cascade of doors kicked inward and hands raised under floodlights. By dawn, Frostpine knew the truth it had half denied for years. The trafficking ring had never left. It had only waited for silence to protect it again. Ash was rushed to emergency veterinary care in the next county as soon as the roads were secured. Smoke damage scarred her lungs. Burns traced her flank and shoulder. The prognosis was long recovery, but survival. When Ryan finally allowed himself to breathe fully again, His hands shook with the release of terror delayed too long. Emily stood outside the emergency clinic, with him as the sun rose pale and slow over blackened trees. Her coat was torn, her hands blistered, her face still carried ash from the fire, but her eyes were steady. "I didn't think," she said softly. "I just moved." Ryan looked at her, not as a rescuer looking upon someone who had helped, but as a man standing at the edge of a truth too large for caution. "You didn't move," he said carefully. "You chose." She met his gaze at last. Beneath exhaustion and smoke, something unspoken surfaced between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition as deep as shared survival. When they returned to the farm that morning, the barn stood in black ruin beneath new snow. Steam rose from broken beams like spirits departing. The land was scarred, but the cabin still stood, and Ash still lived, and the men who had come to erase those facts were now gone. Ryan stood in the snow beside Emily as firefighters cleared the last embers. In the quiet aftermath, he felt the truth settle, not like victory, but like arrival. He had chased justice across states, storms, and graves. He had believed for years that home was something waiting at the end of unfinished work. Now he understood. Home was the woman who ran into fire without hesitation, and the life that refused to die between them. Spring did not arrive in Frostpine the way it did in postcards or calendars. It did not come with trumpets of birdsong or sudden explosions of green. It arrived the way survivors often do, quietly, cautiously, as if testing whether the land was finally ready to keep what it offered. Snow retreated inch by inch from the valley floor. The river loosened its ice-bound breath into a low, persistent song. And in the scarred yard of the Carter farm, where blackened beams still lay like bones beneath melting drifts, the earth began to soften again. Ash returned on a pale morning, washed in silver light. The transport van pulled up slowly on the packed dirt road, its tires whispering through thawing snow. Ryan waited by the gate, his hands still and his breathing unsteady in a way he did not permit himself in any other moment. Emily stood beside him, her coat wrapped tighter than the chill required. The crate door opened. Ash stepped out with careful dignity. Her movement was slower now, measured by memory of pain and the discipline of recovery, but her posture held the unmistakable authority of a working dog who had not surrendered her purpose. The fur along her flank had regrown in uneven shades where burns once bit deepest, leaving pale scars beneath darker sable. Her gait carried a permanent hitch, subtle but honest. Her amber eyes, however, were untouched. They locked onto Ryan instantly with the same fierce intelligence that had survived fire and shadow alike. She took 3 slow steps forward. Then, breaking all composure, she surged the rest of the distance and pressed her full weight against him with a breathy, unrestrained whine. Ryan sank to his knees in the thawing snow as she leaned into him. For a long moment, he did not speak. His hands threaded through her fur with reverence rather than command. Emily watched from a step back, her face soft with something that no longer frightened her to feel. Ash's recovery had been declared a success by medicine, but the truth was carved into muscle and memory rather than charts. She had survived. Rebuilding followed survival, the way morning follows night. Not with triumph, but with work. Emily oversaw the reconstruction of the barn with quiet authority. New beams replaced old ones. The roof rose again, higher and stronger than before. The root tunnel beneath was reinforced and sealed properly at last. No longer a hidden escape, but a reminder of what had been endured. Ryan trained dogs again. At first, it was informal, helping a rancher down the ridge correct leash handling, assisting in scent work for lost livestock, guiding local volunteers who lacked discipline but not heart. Word traveled faster than he intended. Soon Frostpine's surrounding valleys began requesting his aid. Search and rescue units took notice. Offers followed. Then came the badge. The reinstatement arrived not with ceremony, but with a sealed envelope delivered by courier under gray afternoon skies. Inside was the official declaration. The charges that had dismantled his career were expunged. The evidence that once vanished now stood restored. The state acknowledged what he had known in his bones for years. He had not failed his partner, nor his duty. Ryan stood alone on the porch when he opened the letter. The cabin door closed behind him to keep Emily from reading his face too soon. When he finally stepped back inside, she looked up from her ledger and knew without words. "They cleared it," he said simply. She closed the book and rose. They did not celebrate with embraces or declarations. They stood together in the weight of restored truth, quiet as snowfall. For both of them understood that vindication repaired more than reputation. It stitched torn pieces of the future back into place. He could leave now. The law would welcome him again. Cities called with opportunity. Units offered rank. The path that had once been stripped from his hands lay open once more. Ryan did not take it. Instead, he stood on the new barn threshold one morning as the sun finally gained warmth enough to gild the valley floor, and he said to Emily, "I think I'm staying." It was not a question. It was not a pledge spoken dramatically. It was simply a truth placed gently between them. Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. The gesture carried no possession, no fear, only understanding. Ash's training resumed formally with the melt. Her first sessions were short, careful, guided as much by restraint as by hunger for work. But instinct does not forget its language. She relearned search grids with astonishing speed. Her nose never lost its command of scent. Her confidence returned step by deliberate step. And when she completed her first successful field recovery drill, locating a buried indicator beneath wet earth and melting ice, the surrounding volunteers erupted in applause that startled even her. Frostpine adopted her without debate. Children ran to the gate to greet her. Ranchers left bowls of water at fence posts. Visitors asked for photographs not with the farm, but with the dog who had walked out of fire. She became what stories had always needed, a living symbol that suffering could be survived without being erased. Ryan trained beside her, not above her. He no longer commanded from behind authority, but guided through harmony. In Ash, he found not proof of the past, but anchor to the present. Emily watched the change quietly. She had rebuilt not only fences and beams, but rhythms. She no longer measured days only by tasks completed alone. The cabin breathed differently now. It held shared silence instead of solitary endurance. Even grief, that patient tenant, retreated into memory rather than residence. Spring continued its patient advance. Grass pierced the last crusts of snow near the porch. The river swelled with a new voice. And on the first morning, the frost did not return. Ryan stood beside Emily on the cabin steps. Ash raced the length of the yard, chasing meltwater through shallow channels with an ungainly joy that ignored her limp entirely. Ryan turned to Emily and held out his hand. There was no flourish in the gesture, only offering. Emily studied his palm. Once, not long ago, she might have weighed the consequences against loss, might have hesitated beneath the shadow of all she had buried. Now she placed her hand in his with quiet certainty, their fingers entwined. Below them, Ash circled twice before sprinting across the softening field, snow scattering beneath her paws in bright shards. The valley no longer belonged to winter alone. 3 lives that had wandered separate through wreckage and accusation, through fire and silence, now stood aligned beneath open sky. Not because fate had wandered kindly, but because each had chosen to remain when departure might have been easier. And in that choosing, they had made a home. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come through a wounded dog that refuses to die, through a broken man who finds his truth again, and through a woman who chooses compassion over fear. In our everyday lives, we all face winters of the soul, moments of doubt, loneliness, and exhaustion. But God walks beside us even then, guiding our steps and sending hope in ways we may not recognize at first. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us what you felt, and type Amen if you believe in the gentle miracles God still sends into our lives. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to support the channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, love, and quiet redemption.